Welcome to Lisburn, known as the birthplace of Ireland's historic linen industry, and today the third largest city in Northern Ireland, home to a wealth of riveting heritage packed into a compact city centre. On this walk around the heart of Lisburn, we'll take a trip through the city's 4 centuries of action-packed history, and pass by captivating landmarks including Lisburn Cathedral, the Grand Irish Linen Centre, and some of the oldest sites in the history of Northern Ireland's Protestant community. However, we begin on the edge of the city centre in the pristine Castle Gardens, so named as this was once the site of Lisburn Castle. Now, the castle that once existed here, situated overlooking the Lagan Valley that we can see in the distance, was actually more of a reinforced manor house than a major fortress, built in the early 17th century by the Conway family, a wealthy family from Wales who had been granted this land by King James I during the plantation of Ulster. The Conways were the first in a long line of people from Great Britain who shaped Lisburn's rise to prominence over the last 4 centuries. And here, there stands a grand reminder of another of those figures, this being the Wallace Fountain, given to Lisburn by Sir Richard Wallace. Wallace was a wealthy art collector from London who contributed significantly to the development of Lisburn in the 19th century. His donations to the then town, including 5 public drinking fountains like this, only 2 of which survive in Lisburn today. But it wasn't just Lisburn that received a kind share of Wallace's fountains, as in the early 1870s, he'd been living in Paris when the city fell victim to a brutal 4-month siege during the Franco-Prussian War. During that period, many of the city's historic aqueducts, used for delivering drinking water, were destroyed, and so Wallace donated 50 ornate fountains to the city of Paris, and today those fountains are still known to Parisians as Les Wallace. Before it was donated to the public in the early 20th century, meanwhile, the castle gardens here were also once owned by Wallace. But what happened to the 17th century castle after which the park is named? Well, here on the edge of the gardens, you'll find the last remnants of Lisburn Castle, a gateway and part of the old castle wall that date from 1677. The reason that this is all that's left of Lisburn Castle is that in the year 1707, the town fell victim to a great fire, started by accident when hot ashes were thrown out of a window just off Bow Street, and which set a pile of rubbish alight. The blaze quickly spread across Lisburn, destroying almost all of the wooden and thatched roof houses in its path, before it arrived here and destroyed the castle. But by the time of the Great Fire of 1707, the town of Lisburn had only had a very short history. Before the plantation, Lisburn was the site of a small native Irish fort just to the north of the modern-day Wallace Park, in one of the most sparsely populated areas of Ulster. Following the plantation, however, Lisburn grew rapidly in size throughout the following centuries, and despite the town being lost to the Great Fire, Lisburn was regularly modernised with grand buildings befitting its ever-rising status, the grand house covered in scaffolding in front of us here being the imposing Castle House, the former private residence of Sir Richard Wallace in Lisburn. Castle House there was built in 1880, just a few decades before the striking War Memorial that we find here just outside the Castle Gardens, which was unveiled back in 1923. Topped with a magnificent figure of winged victory, Lisburn's War Memorial stands in memory of the local men who died fighting in the 2 World Wars, as well as later conflicts including the Korean and Falklands War. Hundreds of local men were lost in those conflicts, as Lisburn has for decades been one of the region's largest population centres, situated, as we can see from this map, just 8 miles southwest of the Northern Irish capital of Belfast, in one of the most densely populated areas on the entire island of Ireland. Historically, Lisburn and Belfast were closely linked by the linen trade, but here we're passing by Lisburn's former town hall, built in 1884, and which stands on the site of a much older church that helps us understand the origins of Ireland's linen trade, and why Lisburn is identified as its birthplace. Before the grand old Victorian town hall that we see today, its position on Castle Street here was the site of the French Church, an 18th century place of worship that was established to cater to Lisburn's significant population of French Huguenots. Now, the Huguenots were a division of French Protestants who were fleeing religious persecution in 17th and 18th century France, and so many came to Lisburn here, a growing town with an already large Protestant community established by English and Welsh settlers who arrived during the plantation. The first Huguenots arrived in Lisburn in 1658, and they gradually developed a large community, founding their own church and a school in the town, signifying the most established Huguenot colony in Ulster at the time. But they also brought with them skills that helped to bring real prosperity to Lisburn. Many Huguenots had been weavers back home in France, and they introduced finer techniques into Ireland's then infant linen industry. The Huguenots were crucial in the birth of the linen industry that went on to bring immense prosperity to Ulster in particular during the Industrial Revolution. And here at the centre of Lisburn, we're passing by the city's 18th century market house, which today is the home of the Lisburn Museum and the Irish Linen Centre. We'll talk more about the development of the linen trade in Lisburn and across Ireland in a couple of moments, but beside the Linen Centre here, there stands a statue of Brigadier General John Nicholson, who grew up in Lisburn in the 19th century. Standing with the soaring Lisburn Cathedral in the background, the Nicholson statue was unveiled in 1922 to commemorate one of Lisburn's most famous soldiers, depicting him with sword in hand as he led troops into battle during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, considered the defining moment of his military career. The rebellion was a huge uprising by Indians against the rule of the British East India Company, and Nicholson, who died while crushing the revolt, was celebrated at the time as the man who saved India for the British Empire. Nowadays, however, the cruel and violent suppression of the Indian Rebellion is considered one of the key examples of brutality during the days of the British Empire, and Nicholson in particular remains an exceptionally unpopular figure in India. There's a complex legacy behind Lisburn's Nicholson statue, but the building beside it here is one of the most popular attractions for visitors to the city, the local museum and the Irish Linen Centre, telling the story of how Lisburn played a role in the development of one of Ireland's most important industries. The old market house with its iconic clock tower now stands alongside a modern wing which gives extended capacity to the museums inside, which host permanent and temporary exhibitions on Lisburn's history and the development of the Irish linen trade, and which are also home to a number of surprising artefacts, including a piece of linen from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. Even better, entry to the Lisburn Museum and Irish Linen Centre is absolutely free, making it a perfect place to stop by while you're in the city. But just outside the museums, we find ourselves on Lisburn's Market Square, beautifully redeveloped in the 2010s. As the name suggests, this is where markets were historically held in the city, after Lisburn was granted a market charter back in 1628. And nearly 400 years later, markets are still held in the city centre every week on Tuesdays, albeit just a few streets away from here. Before the recent redevelopment, the Nicholson statue stood on the square here in front of the Irish Linen Centre, but it was moved just up the road. And today, the market square is dominated by a row of 4 strikingly modern light columns, on which you'll find inscriptions detailing the history of Lisburn, from its earliest origins in 1609, during the plantation of Ulster, to 2002, when the former town was granted city status in celebration of Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee. They're not the only structures which dominate the market square, however, as here we see Lisburn's Grand Orange Arch, which is erected every year ahead of celebrations marking the 12th, the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne. Standing prominently in the heart of the city, the Orange Arch is a symbol of Lisburn's Protestant and Unionist communities, who make up a majority in the modern city. We'll see more Union flags and symbols of the Orange Order as we continue our walk around the city, and when we pass by Lisburn's Grand Orange Hall near the end of our walk. But as we now find ourselves on Bow Street, you may be interested to know that this central part of the city was involved in the lead-up to the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. A Protestant stronghold with the influx of English, Welsh and later French Huguenot settlers in the 17th century, none other than William of Orange visited Lisburn on his way towards the Battle of the Boyne, stopping one day in June of 1690 to dine in a house overlooking Lisburn's market square, before pushing further south towards the village of Hillsborough, where he stayed overnight. This was at a time when the nearby village of Hillsborough was more politically significant than Lisburn, but this city soon grew in status, and we'll talk more about that later on. But for now, let's turn our attention to the city of today, as we stroll along Bow Street, lined with shops, effectively serving as Lisburn's main high street, while it also lends its name to the Bow Street Mall shopping centre that you'll find at the end of the road, and which attracts many shoppers from the towns and villages in the surrounding region. Now, for the entirety of Lisburn's history, Bow Street here has been the main street in the city, having been laid out all the way back in the 1610s alongside Castle Street, Bridge Street and the Market Square. These four streets formed the main layout of the town of Lisburn for the best part of 200 years, and even in the mid-19th century, Lisburn was known by visitors as a place consisting mostly of this one long street, sloping down from the cathedral. And as you can see from this photo taken in the 1900s, Bow Street retains a fairly similar profile to this day. But having walked down Bow Street from the Market Square, we're now going to make our way off the street towards another city square, the beautiful Lisburn Square, which is home to some of the most impressive architecture in the modern city. We'll find Lisburn Square just a short way down this alleyway off Bow Street, known as Haslem's Lane, whose walls today bear murals and memorials dedicated to Lisburn's riveting history. Now, this lane was built in 1833 to connect the busy thoroughfare of Bow Street, then called Bow Lane, to Smithfield Square, a historic home of local markets. In the early 19th century, both Bow Lane and Smithfield Square were important points in the city's commercial sphere, many shops, factories and workhouses lining Bow Lane, and Smithfield Square having emerged as a new venue for a local market. But until Haslem's Lane here was built, people could only reach the two places by walking all the way around the block via Market Street or Market Place. Haslem's Lane, therefore, was a vital development in 19th century Lisburn, initially built with 23 houses lining it, although today all are gone, replaced by a growing plethora of shops that signal the once small alleyway's development into a busy thoroughfare of its own. In fact, before the building of Haslem's Lane in 1833, there were a number of other alleyways, or courts, which spurted off Bow Lane, developing in the spaces between houses built along Lisburn's main street. However, by the 19th century, the industrial growth and prosperity in Lisburn caused a sharp rise in the local population, prompting developers to build houses where those old courts once existed, and that's why they're no longer visible today. Having passed down Haslem's Lane, however, we've now emerged onto Lisburn Square, an exquisite plaza surrounded by some utterly gorgeous architecture. At the heart of the square, there stands this fetching glass conservatory structure, home to a couple of cafes which stand atop a useful underground car park. Now, although things are fairly quiet on this cloudy morning, Lisburn Square is another part of the city that's been redeveloped only just a couple of years ago to create a busy new shopping and nightlife hub, with the grand buildings overlooking the square housing a number of newly opened shops, cafes, bars and hotels that form part of the Lisburn Square shopping development. The buildings that surround the central plaza of Lisburn Square, meanwhile, are among the most beautiful in the city, although while they may look centuries old, those looks can be deceiving, as they were actually built less than 20 years ago in 2003. Now, the past 20 years have been an important period for Lisburn, because alongside the many regeneration projects that have taken place in the city centre, it was just 2 decades ago in 2002 that Lisburn became a city for the very first time. As we mentioned, Lisburn gained city status during Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee, and it was awarded the title that year alongside the city of Newry, on the border between counties Armagh and Down, about 30 miles to the south of here. Together, Lisburn and Newry were joint 4th in Northern Ireland to become a city, following Belfast, Derry and Armagh. But long before it became a city, Lisburn here had already established itself as one of Northern Ireland's most important population centres, its role in linen production and its historic market having brought prosperity to the then town over decades. Of course, Lisburn's market was for centuries held on the Market Square, Although as the town centre became busier and more congested as a result of its strong growth in the industrial era, it was eventually decided in the 1930s that the market's venue would move away from the heart of town to this point, Smithfield Square, where it's still held to this day. Although when the market isn't on, the square serves as another convenient city centre car park. But just how dramatic was Lisburn's growth in the industrial era? Well, as we spoke about earlier, even in the early 19th century, the town was known for its one long main street and not all that much else. But within 100 years, the local population had tripled in size to over 12,000. A huge growth, particularly considering the impact of the Great Famine of the 1840s. This growth was of course driven initially by the linen trade. The French Huguenots, for all their impact, were followed by English Quakers in the late 17th century, who modernised the traditional methods of linen production by developing innovative chemical bleaching processes and purchasing power looms that allowed for weaving here to take place on a larger scale. While their impact on the town's industry was significant, the Quakers were just one part of a growing diversity in Lisburn's religious sphere during the 18th century. And here on Market Street, we're passing by the town's first Methodist preaching house, which dates to 1772. Religious diversity increased further as the population grew, and especially following the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which allowed Catholics to worship freely too, forming part of a community that went from strength to strength as it entered the Victorian era. Now, while Lisburn may be the birthplace of Ireland's linen trade, its growth actually fed into the development of its neighbour Belfast, which grew spectacularly through the 19th century to become the largest linen-producing city on the planet. As we see the orange arch on the market square hoving into view once again, the centre of Lisburn here is home to one of the oldest Presbyterian congregations in all of Ireland, established in the 17th century after the plantation of Ulster. Settlers from Great Britain established a Presbyterian church in the 1680s here on the edge of the market square, and although it was destroyed during the Great Fire of 1707, it was later rebuilt in 1768, and that's the building that we see here today, the first Lisburn Presbyterian church. Since it was built over 250 years ago, this church has been expanded and modernised, although it was heavily damaged during the Troubles, when an IRA car bomb exploded on Market Street in 1981, destroying many of its historic stained glass windows. Interestingly though, the Presbyterian church recovered the damaged pieces of its windows from the incident, and has put them back together with this new window that you'll find inside the church today, which serves as a memorial to the car bombing, which caused widespread damage to the entire town centre. Sadly, however, this wasn't the first nor the last incident that the town suffered as a result of political conflict. About 50 years before the outbreak of the Troubles, Lisburn's Market Square here was the site of intense rioting during the Irish War of Independence. Lisburn, a staunchly unionist town at the time, was no hotbed of anti-British resistance. However, in 1920, a local policeman named Oswald Swansea was shot dead here on the Market Square by the Irish Republican Army, in revenge for the killing of a Catholic man a few months earlier. The killing of Oswald Swansea sparked outrage across Lisburn, and there followed a day of intense anti-Republican rioting by the townspeople, in unrest that saw Lisburn's town centre damaged by some of the worst fires since 1707, and which caused many local Catholics to flee the town. Here just beside the old market house, however, we find a statue dedicated to the men and women of the Ulster Defence Regiment who served as part of the British Army during the Troubles in the late 20th century. After the Swansea riots of 1920, the Troubles saw the greatest instability in Lisburn, and scores of locals were sadly killed throughout the 1970s, 80s and 90s, both in attacks by the IRA and by loyalist paramilitaries of the Ulster Defence Association, although the town fortunately never experienced the intense sectarian violence seen in Belfast or Derry. But having now passed the UDR Memorial, we find ourselves at the top of Lisburn's Market Square, a wonderful central part of the modern city, even with the memories of past conflict that took place here in mind. Overlooking the Market Square and Bow Street at the top of this slope, however, we find the beautiful Lisburn Cathedral, the site of the earliest place of worship in the entire city. During the plantation of Ulster, this was the site of the smaller Church of St. Thomas, a Protestant place of worship that served the local growing population. The cathedral that stands in its place today, however, is actually the third church to have stood on this site, as the original was destroyed in 1641 and its replacement burned down in the fire of 1707. But the cathedral was rebuilt on a grand scale, and it's remained one of the most distinctive landmarks in Lisburn for over 300 years now, not only for its prominent spire that overlooks the city centre, but also for the many relics of the past that you'll find inside, which tell more of the story of Lisburn, from English, Welsh and French Huguenot settlers to the modern community of today. Now though, we're going to cross over Castle Street and make our way down Railway Street, which, as you can probably guess, will lead us towards Lisburn's beautiful railway station, outside which we'll finish our walk in around 5 minutes' time. Now the railways, which provide a useful link to Belfast in the modern day, were a key part in the development of Lisburn's linen industry in the industrial era. As we mentioned earlier, the skills brought by Huguenots and technology developed by Quakers brought local linen production into the modern era, and large-scale production began here in Lisburn around 1764, although the growth of the industry in this town actually fed into the development of Lisburn's neighbour Belfast, which grew spectacularly through the 19th century to become the largest linen-producing city on the planet. Initially though, linen produced here in Lisburn was transported to Belfast for export by way of the newly built Lagan Canal, which operated for roughly 200 years between the mid-18th century and 1956. Train lines between the two were then opened in the 19th century, but Belfast, by virtue of its advantageous position on the sea, rapidly overtook Lisburn as a linen-producing centre of its own, eventually evolving into what was nicknamed Linenopolis, the largest city in Ireland in the industrial era, even larger than Dublin. But despite the rise of Belfast, Lisburn remained a major centre of manufacturing, with a massive growth in the local population as new houses, workshops, factories and more facilities were built all over the town. This prosperity endured strongly well into the 20th century, until the impact of the Depression of the 1930s hit Northern Ireland's linen trade heavily, putting an end to decades of rapid industrial growth in Lisburn. And that's why the vast majority of the buildings you'll see in the city today date from that boom period. That includes the building across from us here, Lisburn's large Orange Hall, which was built in 1871, and which serves as the home of the local Orange Order. Of course, Lisburn has been a centre of unionist sentiment for centuries, but plans were only made to build an Orange Hall here in the 1860s, nearly 70 years after the order was founded. Standing across the road from the Orange Hall, meanwhile, is another late 19th century building, the Railway Street Presbyterian Church, which was opened in 1864. At the time of its opening, Lisburn's population was undergoing its fastest period of growth, and so the first Presbyterian church that we saw on the market square soon became inadequate for the growing numbers of people attending church. The Railway Street Presbyterian Church, therefore, was opened to increase capacity in the town, giving birth to a new congregation that endures to this day. Lisburn's variety of churches have long served as important meeting places for different parts of the local community, but back in the Victorian era, working locals needed a place not just to pray, but to sit back and relax, and that's exactly what they got here at the end of Railway Street. Across the road from us is the Bridge Community Centre, built in 1890 as a place providing leisure facilities for Lisburn's working men, home to games rooms, reading rooms, a cafe and more, although as it was actually established by the local temperance union, no alcohol was allowed inside. Still, the community centre provided a calmer atmosphere than the many taverns and pubs which existed elsewhere in Lisburn. Today, while the community centre now serves a different purpose from when it was originally built, Lisburn is still home to a range of pubs around the city, many dating from the same late 19th century period. However, while this may be the third largest city in Northern Ireland, Lisburn isn't especially well known for its nightlife, a symptom of its proximity to Belfast, to which locals flock week in and week out to do some shopping, eat out at restaurants, or have a big night out. With just 8 miles separating the two cities, Belfast is very easy to reach from Lisburn. either by a short drive up the M1 or by catching the train into the city centre from Lisburn's railway station just here. It only takes about 20 minutes on the train to Belfast from this station, which was originally opened back in 1839 as the terminus for the very first passenger railway in Ulster. Of course, while this is the place from which many people leave to head up to Belfast, the railway station is also an excellent gateway for those coming to visit Lisburn. And as I hope you'll agree from this walk, there really is a wealth of history on display in this fascinating city, from the remains of its castle to the legacy of Ireland's linen trade, and so much more. Sadly, however, that brings us to the end of our walk around Lisburn for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Lisburn for yourself sometime soon.